You are listening to the Draw 4 Podcast. Good tidings, and thanks for joining us. My name is Joseph Dunlop. I'm a writer for Mana Lake and executive producer of Draw 4 Podcast.
And I'm Brenda Smith. I stream on Twitch.
That's a great qualification.
It's best I got until I qualify for the Pro Tour. Give me a few months here.
Yeah. And speaking of qualifying for the Pro Tour, what is it that you did that got you into that road?
I have qualified for the RPTQ by winning a PPTQ. Well, actually two now, so I'm qualified for the regionals in the next week and the one in June as well.
Wow. You're pretty much a limited expert at this point.
It is my favorite format, yes.
However, there is something that we're both planning on doing in the next week or so. Well,
Standard.
actually, when this comes out, it'll be the coming weekend, but we're both working on Standard. I'm going to Grand Prix Houston. What are you going to?
The RPTQ in Denver, which is Standard as well.
And you're flying from where?
Detroit,
okay. And then I'm driving from Central Texas, about two and a half hours north of Austin, all the way about an hour or two south of Dallas. TJ, who's part of this podcast as well. And then we're driving all the way to Houston, which I'm going to say is probably about 4 to 5 hours.
Oh, wow.
I think it's about that much. I haven't driven from Stephenville to Houston before, but I know it's about 7 to 8 hours from where I live.
Okay, that's awesome.
Quite a few people are going to GB Houston.
I had considered actually flying in for that one, but the RPTQ happened, so that takes precedence.
Well, you did qualify for it. You might as well go.
Exactly.
So we're both going to be taking some variant of Mono Green Ramp because we like our Eldrazi's.
Yes.
We like exiling your stuff. As I said when I was making a lot of YouTube videos of Green-Red Eldrazi during Battle for Zendikar, I was exiling somebody's non-basic land, and I was like, who likes non-basic lands? Ulamog doesn't. So I was getting rid of their crucial lands. And it got better since then because with Oath of the Gatewatch, we got Worldbreaker. So now it's all about that Worldbreaker because you can recur land destruction with a 7-mana creature instead of a 10-mana creature. And then you top it off with an Ulamog for 10 when you've gotten a few more land drops, and it's really awesome. What we're going to do here is we're going to talk about the basic versions of Ramp that you're going to see in the coming weeks. And if you're thinking about playing, you might consider one of these builds. And then we're going to move into the lightning round and just talk for a brief moment about the metagame. And then we'll get to the community question, which has to do with just Eldrazi in general. So first off, the basic mono green or green red ramp package that you're going to see starts off with the must-haves, which are explosive vegetation, or as I call it, veggies. And somebody at game day last week was like, well, what kind of veggie is it? Is it broccoli? Is it Brussels sprouts? And I was like, I think it's broccoli. I was pretty certain.
I agree.
If it's green-red, then it's steamed broccoli. Most people are running a playset, but some run 3. It's just kind of preference. And then there's 3 to 4 Nissa's Pilgrimage. It's kind of a must-have. Now, we'll take a moment here to talk about Nissa's Pilgrimage because you and I had a discussion, and I've had a discussion with people quite a bit, and I've talked about it in my videos on YouTube, about whether it's important to trigger spell mastery.
It's not super important, but it definitely doesn't hurt.
It doesn't hurt at all. And that's the way I look at it. It's like, it's not the end of the world if you don't get that third forest, because at the very least you're fixing your land drops for the next turn. But right. If you've got nothing else in your hand, you need to get some action going. It doesn't matter, honestly, one way or the other, if you have no way to trigger it. So don't freak out, folks, if you can't trigger spell mastery, because it's good if you can do it. It's nice work if you can get it, but it is not make or break. You just want to hit your land drops more than anything else. And then Hedron Archives is interesting to me that people are only playing 2 or 3 or 4. It's interesting to me, since Hedron Archive and Explosive Vegetation in a lot of ways are the same spell, that Explosive Veggies is 4 mana to get 2 lands and play tapped. Hedron Archives is 4 mana to get 2 immediately tappable colorless mana with the option of paying 2 generic mana to tap, sacrifice, and draw 2 cards. So on the surface, it actually seems like Hedron Archive is better, but there are certain situations where you've got both, you have to choose between them, and you have no action if you play Hedron Archive. You know what I mean? Like, you have cards that you can't play for a colorless and a colorless, so it would actually be better to play Veggies and then Archives the next turn, because Archives, once it's in play, is basically the same thing as flipping Rattleclaw Mystic. because you get that net too. So I've always been confused why, if you're going to have 6 total between veggies and archives, why you would go 4-2 rather than 3-3, because you will run out of basic lands at some point, but you won't run out of archive. If you are flooded on mana and you need to sack an archive, you can do that. You can't sack an explosive vegetation. So if you have to run 6 or fewer of those, which I hope you're not doing fewer, don't go 4 veggies and 2 archives. That's my personal advice. Go 3 and 3, just because you will run out of basics late game, and you won't be saying, oh, geez, I wish I could draw vegetation when you draw an archives. You'll be drawing vegetation saying, geez, I wish I was drawing an archive. So that's basically how I see it. Currently, a lot of decks are running 4-4-4 on the ramp package, but then you get to the lower curve of ramp. So what are you running at the lower curve of ramp?
Non-creatures, I just have Oath and Pilgrimage, and then the veggies and archives. That's the ramp.
Okay. Yeah, so you got the Oath, the Pilgrimage, veggies, and archives. So the exact same curve that I'm running. Now, we both were running Ruin up until, yesterday. I've been testing for about 2 to 3 weeks on ramp, maybe longer, and I was trying to make Ruin in Their Wake work because a friend was wanting me to kind of figure out whether that worked for her own testing. And ultimately, I found that if you're trying to get Ruin in Their Wake to be more than just a Sylvan Scrying, which is not a bad thing, but Oath of Nissa is also kind of a Sylvan Scrying if you look at it that way. The Green Ponder is better than a 2-mana Sylvan Scrying. So if you're trying to get it to be more than just a Sylvan Scrying, if you're wanting it to be a super cheap Map the Wastes, then you're having to run more wastes in your land package than is necessary, because then you find yourself in a situation where either you can't even cast it because you don't have a forest in your opening hand, or you're not triggering the clause about waste, and so it's basically just a Sylvan Scrying. And ultimately, I replaced it with Oath of Nissa, and you replaced it with Rattleclaw Mystic.
Yep.
Yeah, it's difficult, because previously the ramp before Oath was 4 Sylvan Scrying, 4 Map the Waste, 4 Nissa's Pilgrimage, 4 Vegetation, 4 Archives. And that just ended up being a little bit much, and now we're more on the mana dork side of things.
I saw Ruin do some amazing things, but like you mentioned, I quite often, more than I'd like to admit to, found I just didn't have a forest. I didn't have a green source to cast the cards I needed to cast. So if there were a way, and I don't know that there is, to make this deck less green dependent, I think Ruin being basically the 2-land, put a land on the battlefield, is a great card. And I liked it better because it can't be impulsed or slashed away.
Yeah.
And that's a huge deal, but casting green cards is even bigger deal. So it ended up not running it and trying the Mystics. But I would say that the Oath of Nissa is absolutely required in this deck. I think it's one of the key components to smoothing out your draws, to finding creatures later game. It's just by far my favorite card in the deck. Well, other than Worldbreaker, probably my favorite card in the deck.
I've only been playing Oath of Nissa for about a day, and now I swear by it. If you are playing Mono Green Ramp or Green Red Ramp, and you're thinking Oath of Nissa doesn't do what you want it to do, then you haven't played it. Or something's wrong, because this card actually is really good. The only thing it doesn't hit is your ramp package, and that's fine. Right. Honestly, it helps you find lands if you need lands. It helps you find creatures if you need creatures. And if you need Ugin, it'll help you find Ugin if Ugin's in the top 3. But it rarely whiffs, and whiffs don't matter if they're so rare that they don't have an impact on your overall effectiveness.
I have not been playtesting as long as you have, although I've had Oath in every build since I've been testing, and I have yet to actually whiff when playing it every time. Now, granted, I may find a Rattleclaw Mystic when I need a land or I need, Ugin, but I still get to draw a card. I haven't just shipped all 3 back to the bottom yet.
Mm-hmm. And there's a funny thing, because you were talking about the forest, and you did the same exact thing that I did independently from me when you were wanting to make Ruin in the Wake work, which was run somewhere between 3 to 5 wastes. You were running 5, I think I was running 4. Because we just wanted to make sure we had it in the opening hand. We both thought the same exact thing. And you look at the mana base and you're like, well, look at all these green sources. I can play all these green spells with all these forests. And the moment you cut it down to 8 or 9 forests, you're like, where is all my green? And then you remember, oh yeah, a lot of my lands are not green sources.
Yep.
Having a playset of Sanctums, a playset of Shrines, and having this handful of other cards for utility that give colorless, all of a sudden you kind of really do need more than 10 green sources to make this deck work. Can't ramp without green, although that's not entirely true. I made a Gambit last week at game day because I was running Ruin last week, and I kept Rattleclaw with no green sources, played it face down against Rally knowing they had no way to interact with it, flipped in the next turn, got my green source, started ramping and won the game. That was a Gambit, because if they had sided in removal, then I would have been dead.
Right.
So ultimately, Ruin's just not worth it for the current build. So here's where we start to break away from cards that are in green and green-red, and we get to whether you run Mana Dorks. Because Mono Green runs all the Mana Dorks, you know? The issue was there was a red-green build that was not running Mana Dorks because of sweepers, because of Kozilek's Return. That build, although it is like, that would be great if I could run sweepers and not have to run Mana Dorks, there's a few things to say about that, which you and I found we're in agreement about. For one thing, once you've gotten your turn 3 veggies off of your Mana Dork, it can rot, you know? It can just die. It doesn't matter. You're already ahead. And when we watched the footage of the Mox tournament, the guy who got second that was playing a really tight mono green build, the reason he lost the final was because he never got a turn 3 veggies in either game. That is vital.
Really important.
Getting that turn 3 veggies is vital. So ultimately, you know, that's the deciding factor in whether you run dorks and whether it matters if they die, as long as you get to the turn 3 veggies. And ultimately, sometimes not having the veggies and playing the pilgrimage first, or not being able to play the veggies on turn 3, playing pilgrimage into veggies is still good unless you're playing against usually a Tarka and Rally. So the current builds, red-green usually does Rattleclaw and Leaf Gilder, but there's that new mono-green build, which is the 8 to 9 dorks, Rattleclaw Mystic, Whisper of the Wilds, because you can trigger it off of several other cards, including Thought-Knot Seer, and then Hedron Crawler, which the deck on the Mox is running 2. TJ and I are cutting 1 so that we can have Kozilek, because we're like, good card. So then there's the other must-haves. The things that make the deck win are the 2 Ulamogs, 2 to 3 Ugins, maybe 1 Kozilek, and then 4 World Breakers. Previously, you know, it was, I'm going to chain infinite Ulamogs, and now it's like, I can chain World Breakers for a lot less mana.
Yep.
So then you get to the electives, as I want to call them, since I'm a college professor. There's Thought-Knot Seer, which is the popular one right now in the mono green. Sylvan Advocate was a favorite for red-green, Thought-Knot in the mono green. And then Hangerback Walker was seeing a lot of play, but it's now kind of being moved over to the sideboard because it's really good against aggro, because you're guaranteed to actually have it die. That was ultimately why I was going to take it out and replace it with one of the other two, was because it just didn't die. It'll either get bounced, or it'll get exiled, or bounced again. And with the prevalence of Reflector Mage, you really just need to have Thought-Knot Seer, because then they're just giving you another trigger. It's kind of like when they bounce World Breaker, like, thanks.
I don't mind that at all, usually.
Yeah.
Unless I'm dying. Then I mind, but other than that...
Yeah, if you're dying, that's a problem, and Reflector Mage is a problem. Thought-Knot Seer is a great answer to that, because they're at least letting you strip another card from their hand.
Right.
So that's the overall package for Mono Green Ramp. And then you kind of cut a few dorks and you put in Kozilek's Return if you're running the green-red version. There's a few other builds. There's green-blue. There's green-black ramp with discard package to kind of complement Thought-Knot Seer. You put in a little bit more discard. But ultimately, the mono green is just fast. All the reasons that you would run Kozilek's Return are problems you can answer just by outracing them. Having 8 to 9 mana dorks and being able to turn 4 Vegetation, Archives, or Thought-Knot Seer is a lot more relevant than wiping the board. And this is coming from someone who tested with a board wipe version of some kind for the past, 5 months in some way or another.
And you prefer the mono green without the...
I played the mono green for 1 day and didn't lose a match. And I was like, that's it. This is the build for the metagame. We'll get to metagame, but briefly, I thought it'd be cool if we could maybe share the journeys that we both had that led us to this deck. So I'll let you start, because you haven't been playing it long, but we did talk about it briefly in the Facebook group for Draw 4 Podcast, where we were talking about it. We made a thread for it because it's about 4 or 5 of us that are playing it. We're all kind of looking at different versions of the same list. You're going to see, you don't know what you're going to see, so you're trying to have just a good general list, and then TJ and I are going to see a specific metagame in Texas. So I'll let you go ahead and dive in and say what about Mono Green Ramp appeals to you and what made you choose this particular build.
So I started actually testing for the RPTQ on Monday because I'd been kind of focused on sealed still and limited. And I went to a friend's house, we started playing, and I actually took the top decks from the mocks. The Ramp, there was a Jeskai deck and Abzan deck, a couple different ones. We proxied them up and we started playing. And I actually had looked at the mono green list, and I just didn't get it. I was like, this seems okay, I guess, but how do you just not die? With all this aggressive, Tarka red, I'm just like, there's no board wipe. This deck just, I'm like, okay, well, he got second, but how did he just not die in the meta? So we played it, and I started with this deck, and I gave my friend a Jeskai list, and I won every game. I was like, okay. And so I gave him another list and played. I lost one that time, but other than that, it was just the deck felt really smooth, which really kind of surprised me. And when I first looked at Worldbreaker, I was like, it's a 5/7 for 7. This doesn't seem that impressive. Who cares about a land or enchantment? And then I actually exiled a land on turn 4, and I realized how good it actually felt.
Exactly.
Yeah, so this deck, I was actually surprised at just how well it ran. The times that I felt clunky were the times when I just didn't have any bigger creatures. And so that's why I've kind of changed around the deck that I'm running now to add a few more threats, basically, and ways to get to those threats. But I think it's just a really smooth, really clean build. And the way I seem to play out is more like almost like a combo deck where you don't really have to worry about what your opponent's doing, because at some point you're just going to kill them. Mm-hmm. You blow up their lands, their creatures don't matter. It doesn't matter if they have Thunderbreak Regent, because your 5/7 reach guy will get in its way. So I've just been super impressed with it, and the testing so far has gone pretty well. I'm still learning the kinks. I'm still trying different builds, so I have the next week to kind of really iron everything out and really figure out the sideboard, because I think that's also going to be key. So that'll be what I work on next.
Yeah, the whole thing you said about Worldbreaker, I can attest to as well. When I was first testing my post-Oath build, I didn't have Worldbreakers in main. They were, and then I thought the same thing you did. Why does it matter if I exile their land? This is a sideboard card because I want to hit their artifacts and enchantments.
Right.
My journey started when we actually started Draw 4 podcasts, right after Battle for Zendikar had come out. We recorded the first episode, and Ben was in that one, and he said that he was certain that the Pro Tour would be all about Ulamog. Now, since then, I've come to the conclusion, and I even said on the podcast last episode, that Pro Tour is not about the metagame, it's about what puts up consistent numbers through linear play, so that the best players in Limited don't have to do that much research in any format but Limited. Mm-hmm. Is nothing against the decks they choose, but they're not going to take a chance on something with Ulamog in it when it's not tested yet. Right. So it wasn't until a few weeks later that Ulamog started to make an appearance. And then I started talking about that on the podcast. I looked at it. The way that it played out, it was like, this is basically ramp up lands like Tron, and then play Ulamogs and Ugins like Tron. Mm-hmm. So it started to look appealing to me. Part of it was the fact that it wasn't on anyone's radar yet. People were like, oh, that's cute. It's not going to go anywhere with all this Abzan and Jeskai Black. Then it started to get on people's radar. Oh yeah, mono green ramp, that's actually kind of good. So I got my Ulamogs at 15 a pop. Got my Ugins after they'd spiked because I just didn't have the funds, but that's fine. I tested it on X-Mage for quite a while. What really appealed to me was the idea of playing Standard without having to invest hundreds of dollars in lands. It felt really good just to put in 15 forests and get some bulk rares and uncommons and call it a day. Mm-hmm. In fact, I got fancy and ordered foil shrines just because. Nice. It just felt really good to find a deck that was in contention in Standard without having to break bank with fetch lands. The deck itself, minus the Ugins and Ulamogs, was probably around 200. Around 200, I want to say. And then you throw in the Ulamogs, only running 2 now, so it's around 50, and then the Ugins just running 2, it's around 50. A $300 Standard deck is what a Standard deck should cost. And that's ultimately what appealed to me. As a human being trying to raise children and not run out of money, it seemed like a good option. And then the more I tested it, like you did, I started discovering this is actually a really good deck. It does stuff that are good stuff, and it plays good cards, and it has good matchups. So I've been testing it the past few weeks with the new build. I played the mono green ramp yesterday. I'm hooked. I'm testing like crazy. You're testing like crazy. So let's then transition over to the lightning round, where we're going to talk about the metagame.
So, going to Denver is definitely unique for me because, not being local and not also bringing in a bunch of people, I'm not sure. So what I've been looking at actually are tournament results, which is how I stumbled upon the mocks, just to see what decks are doing well. The big baddie in the room, the Rally deck, is definitely on my radar. Abzan in all of its forms, anything that casts a Siege Rhino, including the deck that I had actually considered running before this one that I built on Magic Online and started testing, Mardu Green, also is pretty good. And then control variants, also Atarka Red, because when you go into an unknown meta, I'm also assuming people are just going to try to smash face and hit as hard as possible, as quickly as possible. So those are kind of the main decks I've been looking out for and really trying to analyze when I play against them how it actually plays out.
I've talked to TJ extensively because all my testing has been on X-Mage until last week or the week before. Then I did some testing last week with kind of the basic build, borrowing some cards I didn't have yet. And then I talked to TJ about what he's seen in Central Texas, closer to Houston. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of came up with a picture of what we're expecting to see at Grand Prix Houston.
Okay.
Abzan, Black Red Dragons, and Atarka Red are going to be really big, because Texas has always been a mid-range and aggro meta. And then after that, you're going to see Control and Megamorph. TJ assures me there's not going to be a lot of Rally. I expect to see 5 to 10% Rally. There will be people playing it. There will be a Rally in top 8, I'm predicting.
Yeah.
So it's important to be able to beat it. Jeskai Black, there's not going to be a lot of. I'm not sure I'm going to see a lot of Green-Red or Mono-Green or any sort of ramp. Not a lot. Maybe play against one player total in mirror matches. So the big boogeymen are going to be Abzan, Dragons, and Atarka Red. The good thing about that is none of those are actually that bad of a matchup for ramp.
Right.
The bad thing that'll happen is if you don't get a good opening hand, and then you mull, and it's a bad hand, and then the opponent knows how to beat you. Abzan, great matchup, unless they just get the nut draw and you don't get any action. Black-Red Dragons, you've got World Breakers. They can't fly over World Breakers. Atarka Red, kind of an even matchup. If you know what you're doing, then you can just outrace them. 4-color Control, if they know exactly what to do and you don't get the action fast enough, it might be tricky. Megamorph, not a problem at all, honestly. So that, honestly, is my analysis of how the metagame is going to be at Grand Prix Houston. And then probably what you'll see will be a little bit more reflective of what's on MTG Goldfish. A little bit more Control, a little bit more Rally.
Yeah, that's what I'm expecting a Rally to be a large percentage, not a majority by any stretch of the imagination, yeah. But I think there will be, several Rally players. I'm also interested to see how many Bant Company players end up there. I think that's going to be popular too. Okay,
well, the community question for all of you: iTunes, ManaLake.com, YouTube, SoundCloud. Find us somewhere and answer the community question. ManaLake.com is the preferred place. You can go to ManaLake.com/mtguk/author/draw-4-podcast. Or to keep it simple, you can go to ManaLake.com/mtguk. Find this particular episode if you are listening to it on iTunes. And let us know your answer to this question. What is your favorite Magic the Gathering Eldrazi deck in any format? Doesn't have to be new Eldrazi. You could just say Red, Green, Drawn, because that's a lot of old Eldrazi. You could say it's the new modern Eldrazi deck that's sweeping the nation or the world. You could say that you had a fun draft deck or constructed deck back from the original Zendikar. Whatever deck that you have had the most fun either seeing or playing yourself that had Eldrazi in it, what was your favorite Eldrazi deck? Brenda, what's your answer to that?
Well, I feel like I should say the one I'm currently playing, but that would be kind of a lie. Because I sat at home watching the Pro Tour coverage and was just stunned and amazed by the Eldrazi deck, praying that I don't play it in Detroit because it looks brutal, but just how clean the deck runs, it was just awesome to watch.
I would have to say the one I'm playing, and there's a very specific reason for that. The current Modern deck is sweet, but only because the mana base is busted, as we've talked about before on the podcast. It's sweet. It's fun to watch. In most ways. It's even more fun to watch the mirror, such as when LSV crushed the mirror in the top 8 of the Pro Tour, when he, of all things, played an Oblivion Sower, and then grabbed all the things that had been exiled off of Relic of Progenitus. That was really funny.
Insane.
I would have to say it's the one I'm playing, and I'll say why, which is I chose this deck because of how strong it is specifically in Standard. Because you got to choose your Standard deck based on how well it plays in Standard. Not necessarily like how good is the deck. Not like a Modern player saying, man, Standard decks are so bad because they don't have Tarmogoyf, you know? But it's somewhat of a weaker format, and that's on purpose. It's somewhat more balanced, and that's on purpose. And they don't have to ban anything because there's the rotation, so you can kind of choose a deck based on how it plays against other decks in the format, knowing that everything's sort of gimped. Everything is hobbling around, if that makes sense. You've got some cards that are really good in Modern, paired up with cards that you would never want to play outside of Standard. So I looked at the deck and I thought, I would never play this in Modern, but it seems like it'd be really good in Standard, and that's why it's my favorite Eldrazi deck that I've ever played. Just because the way that it plays, it can afford to ignore what's going on around it and still not lose, because everything else in Standard is relatively weak as well. If you look at it in that way, it's very even, and all things being even, I'd rather curve out and play Ulamog, if that makes sense, and Ugin, and Worldbreaker, all things being even. I'd never do that against, say, Tarmogoyf and Snapcaster Mage. Never.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I do have one story to share while we're on the topic of format before we say our goodbyes, because I thought this was really funny, and I posted this on social media when it happened. I was playing on X-Mage, and I set up a match, specifically Standard, and somehow, I guess somebody glitched it or something happened where a guy brought in Modern Elves. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm dead. Until I realized I'm not, because I was playing Kozilek's Return. So they got me down to 8, filled the board with Elves, and then I wiped the board with K's Return. Next turn, they kind of refilled the board a little bit, and then I played Ugin, followed by Worldbreaker, and then they quit the match.
Aww.
I was like, well, how's that Modern match working out for you? How's that Modern deck working out?
So you're saying I could take this to GP Detroit?
Is it Modern?
It is.
GP Detroit is Modern.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like there is potential to go on a higher curve Eldrazi deck. A good build that you might look at is LSV's Bant Eldrazi, because he's anticipating all the ensnaring bridges. He is playing Worldbreaker in Modern main deck, and it's actually quite good.
Huh.
So, I mean, maybe you could build something similar to this for Modern. Just get that land base. Enjoy selling a car and getting a mortgage on your home.
Mm.
And with that, I guess we're going to say goodnight to the audience. You can find us on iTunes, and you can find us on YouTube, and you can find us on SoundCloud. Search for Draw4 Podcast. You can find us on manalink.com.
You can find me on Twitch. Brenda is bored. I'm also on Twitter and YouTube and basically everywhere. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brenda, and you can find me on Twitch.
And I'm Joseph. Thanks for joining us. This has been Draw4 Podcast. Until next time, we wish you good fortune, and may you draw well.